Ubisoft's The Division 2 matched sales of its predecessor on PC, but Ubisoft says the game failed to gain the same level of traction on PlayStation 4 and Xbox. Company CFO Frederick Dugue discussed the game's launch in a recent investor call, noting that an unexpectedly crowded market held the console version back, but that the company is hopeful coming content will boost its future performance. Despite its strong release, The Division 2 ended up short of our ambitious expectations on consoles, said Dugue. We believe this is due for a large part to a more competitive market than expected. The same is not true for PC. However, Dugue says The Division 2 performed well on the platform, despite skipping Steam in favor of Ubisoft's own Uplay platform and the Epic Games Store. Specific numbers were not mentioned in the call, but Dugue notes that PC sales were in line with the first game's massive launch. The Division 2 also saw 10 times more sales on Uplay than its predecessor. Uplay as a whole grew by 150% year-over-year, thanks in part to sharp acceleration caused by the release of The Division 2. In both cases, Dugue was quiet about what exactly The Division 2 best sales targets were, but did note that the company is optimistic about the game's future and expects it to gain traction as new content is released, despite hiccups on console. He also notes that The Division 2 as a whole has seen record levels of digital distribution, player engagement, and season pass engagement for the Ubisoft AAA game. Zelnick shares his thoughts on how subscription services will impact video games. Take-Two Interactive CEO Strauss Zelnick is keeping an eye on the rise of game subscription services, but is not fully convinced the model will have the same impact on games as it did on music and movies. Zelnick lightly discussed both subscription services and Google's coming Stadia game streaming service in a call with investors this week, sharing his thoughts on some of the barriers the tech has to overcome in the process. Overall, he does share some of the optimism many others do toward both trends, noting that the company is a believer in streaming services. On the other side, however, he says Take-Two needs to ensure the business model makes sense for its properties, and that's something that is less apparent at this point in time. You need to find that intersection in business models that serve the customer successfully and also serve everyone else who participates in the value chain, and that may prove to be a little challenging for subscriptions in the space, because I think people do consume video games differently than they consume linear entertainment. That difference leads to shifts in the all-you-can-eat subscription model as far as games are concerned. He says the average American household spends $150 a month watching movies and shows, and only about 45 hours a month on interactive experiences like video games. But those hours spent on linear entertainment are spread across dozens of different shows and films, while that 45 hours spent on games are likely to be only 1 to 3 titles. And so in that event, if you play 1, 2, or 3 titles, and you play them for months in a row, which often happens in our world, then a subscription model may not be such a great deal for the customer, says Zelnick. So, this all remains to be seen. And again, we are open-minded. We want to be where the customer is, but I do not think it's a foregone conclusion that a subscription will be as massive for interactive entertainment as it has proven to be for music, and motion pictures, and television. But we will see. On just a Stadia, Google's instant play cloud-based game platform, Zelnick says the concept is compelling, if that can be delivered. We are very optimistic about the notion of streaming technology, bringing our titles to consumers who currently do not have access to them, said Zelnick, and the promise of being able to sign on to a service with virtually no barriers, without a box in between, and being able to play our games on any device whatsoever around the world, and to do it with low latency. Well, that's very compelling. If that can be delivered, and the folks at Google minimally have said it will be delivered and will be delivered in relatively short order. Originally posted on the official Frictional Games blog, AlienÂ, IsolationÂ is an interesting game. It is the latest entry in a lineage of games that I refer to as horror simulators. It does an excellent job at creating tension, and uses a lot of the knowledge built up over the years to great success. But, because it has such a laser focus on a certain type of play, a bunch problems arise and other parts of the package suffer. It is a great game in many ways. Truly excellent really. But there are some fundamental problems. This led to, for me at least, a devastating flaw. At its core it fails to be a faithful emulation of the original AlienÂ 1979 movie. Before we can properly discuss the game, we need to talk some video game history and design theory. Over the past, there has been two different schools of horror games. One that has a horror wrapping on top of standardized gameplay, horror wrapping, and one that tries to recreate the happenings of a scary movie novel, horror simulation. The former is quite well known and started with games like Lurking Horror, 1987. Mechanically, the game played like other contemporary adventure games, but took place in a scary setting with events meant to frighten the player. The latter one is a bit harder to nail down precisely, but I would say it started out with the 3D Monster Maze, 1982, a game that is neatly captured in its name. The player is trapped in a maze and needs to escape a monster, in this case, a heavily pixelated T-Rex, while the horror wrapping design has thrived over the years, being a design cornerstone for games like PhantasmagoriaÂ, 1995, an adventure game.
7. THGUEST 1993
A puzzler, and Resident Evil, 1996, an action shooter. The horror simulation is much rarer. After 3D Monster Maze, the next game to do it somewhat properly was ClockTower, 1995. It is now time to dig into the distinction between these two types of design. What sets ClockTower apart from Resident Evil is that its core mechanic is not there to entertain. It is there to put the player in the shoes of a protagonist in a horror story. ClockTower does this by having a single monster, a little guy with giant scissors, hunting the player in certain scenes. The player can choose to hide in closets, under beds, and hope that the monster does not find and kill them. Compare this to the core mechanic of Resident Evil, where the player needs to scavenge for ammo, weapons and health potions, and then combat the monsters encountered. Resident Evil's gameplay could really work with any sort of theme and setting, while the one in ClockTower is much more focused on being a horror experience. It is important to mention that a Resident Evil does tons of things to crank up the level of scariness: scarce ammunition, inventory management, limited saves, etc. But none of this gives rise to any specific horror scenarios. The game is still all about shooting various enemies in order to progress. There are very few sections in Resident Evil would fit a horror movie, a novel. But ClockTower is filled with these moments. The core difference can be summed up as ClockTower being focused on having plenty of words that are related to a horror movie: hide under bed, looking into a mirror, run away, push monster, etc. As the player plays the game, they reenact scenes of horror simply by following the rules set out by the gameplay. Resident Evil hardly does it all, the focus being much more on standard tactical combat, with certain scariness attached to it. As a horror simulator, and really horror game in general, TowerÂ is not very successful though. First, much of the gameplay is actually pretty standard adventure game affair. Second, the actual chase moments are quite clumsy and frustrating to play, rarely resulting in any proper feelings of dread and terror. Despite this quite major shortcomings as a horror simulator, TowerÂ is well worth studying. If you look past its flaws,